Welcome to this edition of Suncoast Authors TV, sponsored by Manatee Educational Television. Suncoast Authors TV is a forum for authors, whether Florida authors or folks just passing through, to discuss the thrills and challenges of being a successful author in today's milieu. I'm Sarasota author and editor Liz Corson, and I'm here today with Harvey Eugene Oyer III, who is an attorney in West Palm Beach and the award-winning author of a 5-part series, The Adventures of Charlie Pierce, set in late 1800s Florida. Welcome, Harvey.
Thank you, Liz.
It's great to have you today, and I thought we would start with just a little bit of your personal background before we get into this exciting series. You grew up in, is it Broward County?
Palm Beach County.
Palm Beach County.
And I'm a 5th-generation native. My great-great-grandparents were the first non-Native American settlers of what is today Martin, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade. It was all Dade County at the time. And they arrived in the early 1870s, and our family has been there ever since.
Goodness gracious. So you went to schools in Palm Beach?
I did. Public school system in Palm Beach County, and as did every generation of my family until you go back to when there were no schools in Palm Beach County. So my first ancestors to arrive spent several decades with no education system at all. They were schooled at home.
And then I think you went to where for college?
So I went to the University of Florida undergrad.
Okay.
And then I had a bit of a circuitous route. I went to the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia on a Rotary Foundation scholarship. And then I went to Cambridge University in England and did a graduate degree in archaeology. And then I came back and was in the Marine Corps for a few years as a Marine Corps officer, and then went back to the University of Florida to law school. So I sort of traveled the world and wound up right where I started.
That is a great story. What in the world made you interested in archaeology? It seems like sort of an offbeat topic for a young man from Palm Beach County.
You know, I guess I've been asked that a lot, and I'm hardwired to like history, and history is an important element in archaeology. But I think, truthfully, part of it was watching Indiana Jones movies growing up as a kid.
And what about the Marine Corps? Do you have a father?
No family history in the Marine Corps, but every male member of my family for 10 generations has served in the military back to the colonial militias in the 1600s. So if I didn't do it, I would have broken a long chain that I did not want to be the one responsible for breaking it. So my father was Army in both World War II and Korea, and his father, my grandfather, in World War I. So I think I was the first to do Marine Corps. We've had many Navy, many Army, all the way back to the Continental Army in the American Revolution, and earlier than that in the colonial militias.
And what about Australia? That's sort of a...
Yeah, offbeat as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I won a Rotary Foundation scholarship, which allows you to go to any school in the world, in any country except your own. So they will pay your expenses. My challenge was I only spoke English. So I had to choose a university that taught in English. And I figured as long as it's being paid for, why go to Canada or somewhere near home? Let's go as far away as I can go, and Australia was it.
How long?
And it had a good program for what I was studying, but I think that might have been my secondary consideration at the time.
And what did your parents think about you traveling halfway around the world?
I think they were fine with it. My father, of course, had shipped away to the South Pacific to fight in World War II the day after he graduated from high school, and had traveled the world many times, so I don't think he had an issue with it. If he did, he never told me.
So growing up, you had this 5-generation history of being Floridians. how did that impact your childhood? Were you hearing stories? Were you seeing artifacts from times gone by? What was it like growing up as a fifth-generation Floridian?
You know, I did, but I don't think I achieved a real appreciation for it until I was an adult. And so yes, I grew up hearing the oral history being handed down. Fortunately for me, my grandmother lived with us when I was a child, and she was born in 1896 on an island in a house made of shipwreck timbers with a palmetto frond thatch roof that the Seminoles thatched for us. And fortunately for me, that grandmother lived to be 101. And today we ship Grandma off to a nursing home, but when I was a child, that's not what people did. Grandma lived with you. And of course, we had 3 channels on television and not too many other distractions. So I spent a lot of time with my grandmother hearing these stories. And so it was passed down to another generation. And I'm not sure that I fully appreciated it until I reached adulthood and realized how unique that is in the South Florida that I live in today, where almost everyone is from somewhere else. And I have this unique family heritage of having been there nearly a century and a half. And so that's when I think my full appreciation for my family history blossomed.
I don't really think children understand. They don't have the perspective. So it's not surprising to me to hear you say that it took you getting to a certain point in adulthood before you look back, because I think that's a real similar experience. Most of us
For
have
everyone.
that.
Yes.
And so when older people come to me and say, oh, my children, my grandchildren, they're not interested, I say, well, they might not be now, but they will be. They will be. Now, you had written documentation also to supplement your family's history, and could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, and that's one of the great benefits that I've had in writing this children's book series is the protagonist, Charlie Pierce, The Adventures of Charlie Pierce is the book series. In real life, Charlie Pierce was my great-granduncle, which means it was my great-grandmother's brother, and he kept a journal every day of his life from the time when he arrived here as an 8-year-old in 1872 until the day he died. And while those journals disintegrated years ago, fortunately, before he died, he knew they would disintegrate, so he transferred them to a manuscript. And that manuscript is single-space typed, and it's 740 pages long. And fortunately, it's owned by a historical society and digitized and available to anyone that wants to see it. And many scholars have used it. But I used it not for the same purposes that those scholars had done PhD dissertations and master's theses. I extracted the stories of his childhood, which were just remarkable. If you could imagine a Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer / Swiss Family Robinson type of life that he lived in the wild jungle frontier of Florida, it was a real adventure. And I took those stories and put them in a book series to remedy exactly what you identified, which is kids not really having an interest in history when they're young, only growing up to be middle-aged and lament that they didn't learn more about it. So what I've tried to do in this book series is create cool, fun adventure reading for kids with kids their own age that they can identify with. Same moral decisions and dilemmas. Do I lie to mom and dad? Do I fight with my sister? Do I run away from home? And the kids, the readers today, our children and grandchildren, get caught up in this cool adventure story of kids they can identify with, but they are unwittingly being taught all the Florida history that they don't want to learn out of a textbook. I sort of dupe them into learning what we want them to learn, walking them through the history, the personalities, and the place names that is Florida's history.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the series, The Adventures of Charlie Pierce. The American Jungle was the first of the 5.
Yes.
And then followed by The Last Egret.
And then The Last Calusa.
Last Calusa, Barefoot Mailman, and then wrapping up with Charlie and the Tycoon, because as we discussed a little earlier, to my chagrin as a fan, you told me that the 5 are all we're going to get. Is that, can I persuade you otherwise?
I would love to write more, but I think it's a natural stopping point for several reasons. I wanted to write about the pioneer era of South Florida's history, and that started, at least on the East Coast, when my family arrived, becoming the first non-Native American settlers. So that was after the American Civil War. And it ended, the pioneer era clearly ended when Mr. Flagler, who I call the tycoon, put a railroad down the east coast of Florida. And of course, his friendly competitor, Henry Plant, was doing the same thing on your coast of Florida. And that opened up Florida to really anyone that wanted to come here. It was no longer hard to get in and get out the way it was when the pioneers arrived. So those are the natural bookends of the pioneer era. I also had the additional challenge of my characters are obviously getting older in real life, but I couldn't let them get older in the book series. And clever fourth grade kids that read these books start to do the math and say, wait a second, if your family arrived here in the early 1870s and Flagler's putting a railroad through in the 1890s, how is it that Charlie and Lily and Tiger, your characters, never get any older? And of course, I can't let them get older. It's like an episode of The Simpsons. Bart and Lisa always stay the same age. My characters had to stay the same age, but at some point that becomes a little ridiculous. So I think that was the natural ending point.
Because you have Charlie and his friend, who is a Seminole Indian.
Tiger Bowlegs.
Tiger Bowlegs. And then you have Charlie's sort of tomboyish little sister, Lily. And I personally think that you could have some contemporaneous adventures. Tiger could have an adventure, Lily could have an adventure. You see where I'm going with this?
You're absolutely right. I just as easily could have called this The Adventures of Lily Pierce. She doesn't play much of a role in the first book because she's too young, but she clearly hits center stage in the second book and largely hijacks the storyline for herself and most of the remainder of the books. And it's interesting because the first book, which she plays a small role in, I imagine I have more boy readers. Clearly, the second book onwards, I have more girl readers. They really identify with Lily. When I visit schools and have book signings, the first question I ask as each child comes to me to have their book signed is, who is your favorite character and why? And overwhelmingly with the girls, it's Lily. And even amongst many of the boys, it's Lily, because she's such a smart, tough, outdoors, tomboyish type of character. So even girls that are not tomboyish, I think, fantasize about being a tomboy in that era of Florida's history. So yes, it could have been The Adventures of Lily Pierce.
One thing I was really interested in when I first read that these were children's books, I guess I had in mind sort of a large format, Make Way for Ducklings, One Morning in Maine type thing. And I was very taken with the size and the portability of the books. What kind of thought process went into the design of the books?
I think I just wanted it to be different. And that's worked against me in some cases because bookstores and school book fairs are designed for a standardized book size and length. And their book shelving system is designed for that. So in some sense, it works against me. But I like it. It's unique. It's the landscape horizontal oriented. It's a different paper stock. It's a different everything than your typical scholastic or other book that's used in the school. So truly unique design. And so far it's worked for me.
I love the illustrations. The front cover shows Charlie and then the main theme. And then there is also information, educational information on the back covers as well that tie into the theme of each book. And there's also a terrific map in the front of each book, which I found very engaging, gives young people a sense of the perspective of where we are and where these adventures are taking place in Florida. So the design to me was very appealing and very effective, I think.
I think so as well. Interestingly, I did the first book, The American Jungle, with no map in the front of it, and it was teacher feedback. They said it'd be really great if you had a map that helped the kids spatially follow the storyline. And so then I had a map made, but I had to insert it in the book. And when we did our first reprint, we of course put it on the inside front cover of the book, and it became wildly popular because it allows the reader to follow the storyline and all of the place names. And of course they can take these historic place names and compare that to the landscape of Florida that they know today. And it really helps the kids, I think, envision what they see today as a shopping mall or a gated housing community, what that was historically.
One thing I think that's really interesting about your story is your profession, because you are not just a full-time children's author, are you, Harvey?
No, it's a second job. It's the one I'm most passionate about, but my day job is I'm a lawyer, and which is a busy career on its own, and throw in writing, publishing, distributing 5 books, and it makes for a lot of sleepless nights.
But what kind of lawyer are you?
So I ironically represent developers, which is interesting because people generally associate developers with people that are harming Florida's environment, and here I am writing books about Florida's environment that could be considered conservationist type of books. But I don't find it to be incongruous. I actually, each of these careers helps me in the other one. And I think I can help guide my clients to more thoughtful impacts on the land, better development patterns, green building standards. And at this point in my career, fortunately, I can pick and choose my clients. So I only pick the ones that I think have sustainable development.
That is very good news, because it's impossible to read these terrific books and not come away with a certain amount of sadness, whether it's because of the theme of the book or just driving from Bradenton to Sarasota and looking at the cow pastures, the very few cow pastures that you pass, and imagining a 400-unit apartment complex named Live Oak Apartments.
Yes.
And it just seems like every cattle pasture, every orange grove, everything we see. It used to be, even 15 years ago, you drive from Tampa to Sarasota and it would be dark. And now at every single exit, there is a Walmart or a Kmart or a McDonald's, or maybe all of those things combined. And we are really witnessing a huge rush of development. So to read these books, to read about the slaughter of birds, to read about Mr. Flagler coming down and Charlie helping him with the jungle road, and to read about The Last Calusa. When I read The Last Calusa, I'm not embarrassed to say that I cried. It was very poignant and touched me. So for you,
Thank you.
Well, for you to say that these are children's books, I would take exception to that, because even though I think a very smart 4th grader would get a lot out of these books, especially if guided by an adult, but as an adult, I loved them. They were just terrific.
Well, thank you for saying that. I actually have a lot of adult readers. Of course, they bought the books to give them to their children or grandchildren. Some of them read the books with their children. Some of them maybe wanted to take a sneak peek before they gave it to them as a Christmas gift. And I hear weekly, if not daily, that they sat down and read all 5 books and learned more about Florida's history, reading children's books than they have in decades of living here. And I did write them to a pretty high level. In fact, when I wrote the first book, I was told that I needed to dumb it down, that was not appropriate for public 4th grades in the state of Florida. And I thought about it because that seemed to be the trend at the time, but I didn't. I purposefully left it written at a pretty high level that causes a child to ask, what does that word mean? What does that concept mean? And actually, as I went on, I stepped that up a bit. So while these are used in the 4th grade, they're probably written at a 6th grade level. And I've received a lot of compliments from media specialist teachers, parents. Thank you for not dumbing this down like much of the other curriculum has become as it becomes more standardized. So if you can read this on your own in the 4th grade, you're a good reader.
I would have to agree. You know, Harvey, one of the things that I like the best about these books, even coming to them as an adult, is I feel they really do stack up with the best children's books that I've ever read, which it's been my experience. I loved them as a child, and I can think of the Narnia series by C.S. Lewis, but I came back to those books repeatedly, and each time over the decades that I've been rereading these same books, I took away from them a different message, so that a young person is going to very vividly, in my opinion, relate to Charlie or Lily or Tiger. But an older person is going to feel a sense of loss when they read The Last Egret or The Last Calusa. So I believe that these books will really stand the test of time because you'll find that people come back to them over their lifetimes.
Boy, I hope so. Thank you for saying that. That, of course, is the goal, is to layer enough information and thought-provoking ideas into a book that it appeals to people at different stages of their development, which I think is why I have so many adult readers as well. There's a layer in there that is meant for someone older than a fourth grader. So I hope I accomplish that. I don't want these to work now but not work in the future. I'd like these to stand the test of time long after I'm gone. I frankly hope that this is my legacy, not getting a development approval for a developer. I hope my legacy is to truly alter the way the next generations of Floridians view their state and their water supply and how they treat the state, because they have a fundamentally better understanding of Florida as a result of these books.
And one of the things I really thought was so powerful was to see the tension between the natural world and the developed world, which each of these books brings out, and especially, I thought, came to kind of a climax in Charlie and the Last Tycoon. And I was hoping you could tell our listeners a little bit about the plot and what happens.
Sure. So every storyline has to have a tension, good guy, bad guy, love story, something of that nature, and to create the arc of the story. And this one, the final book, Charlie and the Tycoon, the tension was Mr. Flagler's grand vision for Florida. And truly, I think of any person in the history of Florida, Flagler had the greatest vision and the means and the willpower to effectuate it. So he radically altered the east coast of Florida forever, took it from a wild jungle frontier to the West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, Miami that we know today. And the tension in real life, and therefore in this book, was half of my family bought into Flagler's vision and thought it was wonderful and wanted civilization, and they wanted grocery stores and newspapers and magazines and things that we hadn't had for 2.5 decades. And the other part of my family didn't like it at all. They liked the peacefulness of the jungle that we lived in, the clean water, not clearing land and scaring the animals away. And it created a rift within my family in the 1890s between those who embraced Flagler's vision and those who did not. And that is a story that is equally important debate today as it was in the 1890s. And that is, we need economic development. We need to earn a living. We want to have a job base in Florida, that our children graduate college and come back to Florida and not go to New York and Atlanta. But at what cost? How much are we willing to sacrifice in our natural world? What is the carrying capacity of Florida and its water supply? So it's this balancing act that we, I think, as voters and politicians, it's our biggest struggle today. And it was a struggle for my family in the 1890s. And I would argue if we came back a century from now, it would still be the great debate. So I put that in there for a reason. And I didn't lead the reader to one position or the other. I tried to, through my characters, lay out both sides of this dilemma, for lack of a better word, and let them begin to analyze and make their own decisions. Because after all, these fourth grade readers, not long from now, will be the governors, mayors, state legislators, and voters that lead Florida. And I want them to begin understanding this dilemma for which there is no right or wrong answer. It's a balance.
Well, it really came home to me the other day when I was going home from my aunt's nursing home, and I saw a stray dog. And I keep dog food in the back of my trunk, and I usually hiking boots and a bowl of water and those kinds of things. So I saw the stray dog, I pulled over, and I started calling to the dog, and I started looking at this dog, and I thought, Liz, I'm not really sure that's a dog. Well, it turned out to be a coyote. It was this skinny little coyote, and it was covered in mange. And it turned out that this coyote has been cruising the neighborhood for a while, and people speculate that it has traveled from an area that has been developed. So you have the last Calusa, I give you the last coyote. And we have governmental agencies that are struggling to figure out what to do with this coyote, try to humanely deal with it. But I would imagine across Florida there are tens of thousands of animals that are on the move, whether they're turtles, whether there's birds, coyotes. The natural world is under siege, and it's because of the development that you lay out so beautifully 100 and some odd years ago in these books.
Well, we see that especially with sentinel species like a Florida panther, very high profile. They make a license plate for it, but that is the story of the Florida panther. You know, it's being hit by cars and having their habitat where they would live and feed now have housing developments on them. And so we were in a crisis situation 20 or 30 years ago where we were down to a handful of Florida panther. Fortunately, the population has somewhat been restored, but that's probably the best example of man's impact on the land. But we have to be realistic. We're not all going to move out of Florida, and we need to find a way to coexist with our water supply and our animals and our air and our coral reef system. The challenge is finding that right balance.
That balance. I agree. Well, this is a terrific series for fourth graders and up.
And up.
So let me heartily endorse, you've been successful in putting these books into libraries and school systems across Florida.
Yes.
And I wish you every success, because this is such an important, timely message for not just young people, because they've got 10 so years before they can vote. And if their parents and grandparents start reading the books, perhaps change will be affected, and I certainly hope so, because these are very powerful indeed.
I appreciate you saying that. I know that we all had experiences as children, whether it was a special teacher or a relative or a field trip, some experience that you never forget that helped shape who you are. And my goal with these books, is sort of aspirational and lofty as it sounds, is that something in these books, the characters, the episodes, are emblazoned in the souls of these fourth graders, so that when they're 30, 40, 50 years old, they still remember the moral to these stories. And it shaped their, trajectory and moral compass in life. And that's really the goal with the books.
I have a very personal, strong feeling that you will be very successful, and that people will look back on these books as pivotal moments in their lives. So thank you so much,
Thank you, Liz.
Harvey, for being here today.
My pleasure.
And you have any last thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I want to thank you for bringing me to this coast of Florida. I travel the state a lot, and of course, I spend a lot of time on the East Coast where most of the storylines play out. So thank you for inviting me to your community, which has a rich, wonderful, diverse history, and I'm delighted to be here and hope that your community embraces the books the way most of Florida has.
I believe we will, and I am going to do what I can to help out, because I was very touched. I was very moved with these books, and I appreciate you writing them and carving out from what I'm sure is a very busy professional schedule to put them on paper, because I know that must have been a challenge. So thank you, Harvey.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for today. I would like to thank Harvey Eugene Oyer III for joining us, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this edition of Suncoast Authors TV. I'd also like to thank the professional staff here at Manatee Educational Television for the opportunity to be here today. If you have a suggestion for an upcoming installment of Suncoast Authors TV, whether it's a topic, a particular challenge, or you'd just like to be a featured author, please contact me at lizcorson.com. Until next time, thanks again.